Welcome, everyone. This is a special meeting called by the Wellstone Club. My name is Ann Schwartz, and I'm the chair of the Wellstone Peace Committee. We're a grassroots organization that's affiliated with the California Democratic Party. And we're basically progressive activists who are committed to building electoral power and strengthening social justice movements. This is Phyllis Bennis. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Phyllis is at the Institute for Policy Studies and has historically focused on the Middle East, but also on US war, foreign policy, and the United Nations. So Phyllis, let's just turn this over to you.
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to talk about the Ukraine crisis that we're facing right now. History, I think for all of us, is determined, is shaped by when we start the clock. And we can start the clock at a bunch of different points, which would tell us something different about the origins of what's going on in Ukraine, the origins of Russia's intervention in Ukraine, the origins of NATO as a military force, etc. And I think the challenge that our obligation, if you will, our responsibility to challenge this great power competition that is rising is one of those key points for us. I would say that right now we need to recognize some immediate questions, and that includes the understanding that nothing in this US history of provocation and intervention of various sorts, false promises that were made and broken by the US regarding NATO relative to Russia, starting with the very moment of the collapse of the Soviet Union, none of that makes this invasion by Russia either inevitable or acceptable. It is crucial, though, that we understand some of the reasons why it happened. The global war on terror, or the forever wars, have not ended. That, I think, is important. The war as it was being waged in Afghanistan was ended, although threats against Afghanistan remain. But other venues of the global war on terror continue, and we need to remain focused on them as well as this broader global strategy that we're seeing taking shape right now. In these last years, Putin has clearly recognized that NATO remains a threat to Russian power. NATO, we shouldn't forget, was created not just as a sort of arbitrary military alliance of the US and its buddies. It had a very specific goal, which was to keep the US in Europe, keep the Germans down and the Russians out. That was always how it was described. That didn't change, unfortunately, with the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. It was designed as an instrument of the Cold War. It was designed to help the US win the Cold War and to make sure that the Soviet Union lost the Cold War. Well, that happened in 1991. So by any logic, it should have been the end of NATO. But as we know, NATO searched for and found new definitions, new raison d'etre for what it should do. And that included out of area military action, including, of course, in Afghanistan, marginally in Iraq as well. And of course, in Kosovo, where the US decided to use NATO when it realized it could not get support of the Security Council to endorse a war, that it would go to the NATO High Command and say, we need you to authorize this illegal war. That will make it legal, even though nothing in international law, of course, authorizes NATO to make a decision like that. This was absolutely a hammer and nail question. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you're NATO, every international crisis of any sort requires NATO military intervention, an easy one. That was the basis for the war in Kosovo. So all of that, I think, is important to understand, but we come back to the notion that none of that provocation, none of those war crimes that were carried out, none of those violations of international law, none of that made this Russian invasion of Ukraine acceptable. It had everything to do with challenging the US effort to assert its sole superpower identity, etc. And Biden, we should be clear, I think is certainly wrong when he said, he was right when he said that the war was unjustified. That's true. He was wrong when he said it was unprovoked. There was plenty of provocation. The provocation didn't come from Ukraine so much as it came from NATO and the United States. So then our job, I think, is to take that information, take that background, and come back to what's happening today in this horrific crisis in Ukraine and say, what will help end this war sooner rather than later? We know that every war at the end stops, ends, halts with negotiations. But the big question is, how long does it have to be waged? How many people have to die? How many cities have to be destroyed before you get to that point? So what can we do that would help move towards negotiations and diplomacy instead of war? Maybe this will include neutrality for Ukraine. Maybe it'll include the US and other NATO leaders saying out loud what they've whispered at various points in the last 20 years, that Ukraine is not going to be a member of NATO in any foreseeable future. It was very important that President Biden has been reasserting that there will not be US troops on the ground in Ukraine, but we should be very clear that that is not the same as saying that the US is not playing a military role in this war. It is. There are massive thousands of more troops that have been sent to countries in the neighborhood. The arming of Ukraine is escalating at a massive scale. We may see drones perhaps going into Ukraine. You know, Biden was very clear that he's talking about US troops on the ground. That leaves a lot of leeway these days. So we come to the question of diplomacy, not war. What does that mean beyond the slogan? We have to be able to include, we have to be able in our advocacy work to explain what that would really look like. Who would be involved in these negotiations, in these discussions? Of course, it means Russia and Ukraine, but does it also mean the US and NATO, the other major power at play here? Or do we demand that rather than the US and NATO, the negotiations should be Ukraine and Russia and the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is largely defunct these days, but which has the potential, because it involves all countries in Europe, including the United States, along with them, but it includes Russia, includes Ukraine. It provides a much broader range of potential power. So then the question emerges, well, what would diplomacy look like? What would be the issues on the table? So I would say that the issues on the table start with number one, an immediate ceasefire. Number two, number three, number four, number five, an immediate ceasefire. That's the current immediate priority. Then the question of Russia pulling back its troops, pulling out its planes. Of course, in a ceasefire, it would stop all military assaults, both sides would, but it means a Russian pullback. Now, it also means, what does the other side give up? So the possibilities are that Ukraine would declare itself as a neutral country. It's all, the president has already, Zelensky has already said that that's something to be discussed. Neutrality is one part of that. Maybe it does include this notion of recognizing and acknowledging that Ukraine is not going to be joining NATO anytime in the near future. That's all part of step one of the diplomacy. It could be based on the earlier Minsk Accords that were, of course, being violated by both sides, both Russia and Ukraine. But in theory, it included guarantees of Ukrainian sovereignty, Ukrainian neutrality, some level of autonomy for the Donbass region. It didn't work out the first time. Maybe that could be the basis, maybe not. But that immediate sense of urgency for an immediate ceasefire, a Russian pullback, and then the concessions around Ukraine's role in terms of neutrality, no role in NATO, that's all number one on the what diplomacy would look like. Number two, renegotiating the various weapons and disarmament treaties that have largely been allowed to lapse across Europe. Some of them were abandoned deliberately by the Trump administration. A couple of others are about to expire. So we have the whole set of what these abandoned treaties could be preventing, but now are not, including the question of the presence of US tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, in NATO countries, in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We need the restoration of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that Trump had abandoned, the conventional forces in Europe, the New START Treaty. All of these treaties need to get back on the table and back into an enforceable position. Learning from the past about it's not enough to just have the treaties out there in the world somewhere. There's got to be a fight for enforcement of those treaties. Then number three, we move to longer term negotiations that it could include the creation of a nuclear weapons free zone across all of Europe, the demilitarization of Europe as a long-term goal, the rebuilding of the OSCE itself, and an entirely new, different security architecture across Europe, with a strengthened OSCE, going back perhaps to the Helsinki structures across all of Europe. All of these would be possible as long-term negotiations once diplomacy is underway and has replaced this ongoing drive towards escalating war. Right now, it's a very hard challenge. Right now, the answer to the question of, well, how you're going to force Russia to show up, why do you think Russia would show up? It's not an easy question to answer. There's no guarantees. But I think we have to start with, as progressives, as advocates, as activists, we have to start with what we think is necessary to end this war, not what we think is going to happen. Right now, what I think is going to happen is that Congress is going to vote for a lot more money, a lot more weapons, and the threat is there of this being extended into a very long-term military battle that could lead to enormous civilian casualties, the destruction of cities. I mean, this could really be disastrous, even before we get to the question of the very, very unlikely, but not impossible chance that this could escalate to a nuclear exchange between the two largest nuclear weapons powers in the history of the world. And the fact that it's such a small chance is not enough, in my view, to say we shouldn't worry about it, because the stakes are so inordinately high. And that's what we're, I think, really facing right now. There's plenty of examples to point to over the years about US hypocrisy, the reality of the expansion of NATO and how that was seen as a very significant threat to Russia, the promises that were made and then violated about NATO expansion, or that would happen or wouldn't happen. The entire period of the post-Cold War era, where NATO emerged from being supposedly a defensive regional military alliance to a new way of exerting more power outside of Europe, whether it was in Afghanistan, whether it was in Iraq, very parallel to what the US did with the Gulf War, the first Gulf War in 1991, using that as a way of reclaiming its superpower status. All of that is true. This all shapes and frames how we understand how this crisis began. But I think our concentration right now needs to stay on immediately, how do we end this war? How do we bring this war to a rapid end? There's current examples of US hypocrisy just in the UN vote yesterday, comparing that to the similar vote on Iraq in 2003, where the US sent these threatening letters to every member of the General Assembly saying, if you have the temerity to call a General Assembly meeting on this question of Iraq, we will view that as an attack on the United States. And we hold that as very important. It was directly threatening to all these countries. So the hypocrisy is enormous, but we need to put that to after the war has been brought under control. So I think that's the hard part. What are we looking at is being used instead of diplomacy? Sanctions. Sanctions are very key in this question, I think. It's very important, I think, for us to not only understand ourselves, but to consistently use the language of recognizing sanctions not as an alternative to war, but as an act of war that can, in many occasions, and has been responsible for the deaths of far more civilians than the military attacks themselves. Iraq being, of course, the clearest example, where over 1 million civilians died as a result of sanctions, far more than were killed by the military. 500,000 children under the age of 5 who were killed by sanctions by 1996, just in the first 5 years of the imposition of those sanctions. That's the lesson of what this means. Sanctions, we should note, are included in the UN Charter, not under Chapter 6 that deals with the peaceful resolution of international conflicts, but under Chapter 7, which deals with the authorities of using military force. Because in the UN context, in the UN Charter, it's understood that sanctions are an act of war. And that needs to be how we understand them. I don't have any problem, particularly, for example, in targeting the oligarchs that have historically surrounded Putin, although there's real questions right now about whether they have any influence on him at all. I have no problem with putting some of them under personal sanctions, going after their yachts, these giant mega yachts that have been collected in the last couple of days. There's 3 or 4 of them somewhere. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But we have to understand that's not likely to work. That's not likely to actually lead to a decision change by Putin for a host of reasons. Some of the international individual sanctions are very problematic. When you put sanctions, for instance, on the head diplomat in Russia, Lavrov, you have to take into account, if you ever get to serious negotiations, Lavrov is going to have to be involved. If he's under a travel ban and can't leave Russia, that's going to make things more complicated. It's going to make it harder. Do you want to do that? You want to make it harder for the purpose of being able to say that we are sanctioning, you know, the spokesman for Putin? That's a real question. I think that the broader question, of course, is when we get to the broad economic sanctions that US officials now acknowledge. They don't usually acknowledge it this directly, but they now acknowledge that the goal of these sanctions is to cripple the economy. That means the goal is to make sure that ordinary people in Russia, 140 million ordinary people, are going to suffer from those sanctions. That includes the exclusion of all Russian banks from the SWIFT process, which is the banking exchange internationally, which will have a huge impact on ordinary people. Already is, with the shortage of cash. People can't get their own money back from ATMs. The freezing of the assets of the central bank, just what we're seeing also in Afghanistan right now. This is going to impact the entire population and will probably do very little to force a change from Putin. It could, but there's certainly no indication of that. What we know will happen is that millions and millions and tens of millions of people will be impacted in terrible ways by this, including people who are now so bravely coming out against this war in Russia. Are sanctions imposed by the US and NATO countries and the so-called Western world, are they going to reverse that anti-war sentiment? That's a very real danger. Then we get to the question of the consequences that may emerge from all of this. We see already the increasing military budgets. The US budget is going from this year's $753 billion to over $800 billion, and is likely to get to $1 trillion a year, one of those unfathomably big numbers that we can't even envision what that looks like. But that kind of military increase guarantees that there will be less money available for a Green New Deal, for Medicare for all, for jobs, for education, for all those things that we have been working for and fighting for so desperately, and that we so desperately need. Look at Germany, the increase in the decision-making by the Bundestag just 3 days ago, to go to a 25% raise this year in their military budget, to bring it up to the 2% of GDP that's demanded by NATO. Most of the NATO members say, we're not doing that. That's crazy. Nobody should be spending that money, that kind of money on their military. We need to take care of our people. We're not going to do that. Germany was the leader of that position. Overnight, there's been this incredible shift where Germany now says it's fine to sell EU weapons to a nation at war, which has never been something Germany was willing to accede to. And we're going to raise our military spending to 2% of GDP. Japan is talking about raising its GDP, its percentage of GDP for the military, to bring it up to speed with NATO. NATO itself is being strengthened by this war. New NATO members are emerging as possibilities. Sweden and Finland, the 2 longest neutral countries in Europe, along with Switzerland, are now talking about whether they might want to join NATO, and the level of unity around militarizing all of what NATO does is on its way up. This is not weakening NATO. This war is not weakening NATO. It is strengthening what NATO is going to look like afterwards as a military alliance, undermining the diplomatic forces across Europe, whether the European Union, and particularly the OSCE. And then who's profiting from the war? There's always somebody to profit. There's always money to follow. As usual, it's the arms manufacturers, the arms dealers around the world. The war profiteering from this war is stunningly public. You had the CEO of, I think it was not Boeing, it was Raytheon, who told one of his shareholder meetings about, this was before the invasion, just as the crisis was rising, that we're a little uneasy about the impact on our bottom line of the end of the US war in Afghanistan, because after all, that was pretty profitable for us. We made a killing in Afghanistan. He didn't say those words, but that was the essence of what he said. And he went on to say, but we're seeing good news from Eastern Europe. So we think that we're going to be back okay again. So they're licking their chops over the possibility of making a killing again from this war. And we're even seeing now, I just saw this today, the gun owners of America are gleeful around the war in Ukraine because they're seeing it as proving that in their view, and here's the quote from the president of Gun Owners of America, the situation in Ukraine undermines Biden's gun control narrative of no one needs an AR-15, period. That's what Biden said. And they're saying, well, this undermines it because that's how Ukraine is going to win this war, by housewives and lawyers and shopkeepers being handed an AR-15, their version, to go out and kill Russians. And they think that's what's going to end this war. So we are facing a very serious set of consequences here. The question about the definition of NATO is very, very important. When the Cold War ended in 1991, there was immediately a demand across Europe, across the United States, among lots of progressives, peace activists, and others, to say this should be the end of NATO. No to NATO was the cry. Every 2 years at the NATO summits, there were protesters saying no to NATO. It's time to recognize this as a chronological anachronism. It's over, it's done, go away. And there was a fight within NATO to say, well, what is now our goal? We were created to fight against the Soviet Union. We kind of won that fight, so should we pack up and go home? Oh no, we should become an out of region military force. We should become something else, an instrument of fighting for protecting the US role as the sole superpower, maybe over Russia and China together, to make sure that diplomacy does not replace militarism as the basis of how the world is organized. All of these things are central to the question of what is the new definition of NATO. By the time it got to its 50th anniversary in 1999, that was the year of the Kosovo War. So that was like, oh, good, we have a new role to play now. We will be the ones who authorize new wars for our members to participate in. So when we look at these budget questions, the military budget in this year for the State Department and USAID was $41 billion. That was a 22% decrease from last year. The military budget, $753 billion, was 18 times the budget for diplomacy and international solidarity. Martin Luther King taught us that budgets are moral documents. Those budgets show us what the real priorities have been of the US. That shapes how we challenge this war, how we move quickly to fight for an immediate ceasefire, and how we then carry that forward to make sure that we are challenging militarism, that we are challenging military spending, and that we are challenging future US wars, whether they are against near peer competitors or the so-called forever wars of the global war on terror. There's a very good new piece that Andy Bacevich just did that's in The Nation this afternoon, where he puts himself in the voice of JFK and how Kennedy dealt with his two biggest international crises, one of which was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the other was the creation of the Berlin Wall, and spoke of how he chose appeasement in both cases. And he used that word deliberately, of course, to evoke the question of 1939, and said that it was the choice was appeasement rather than confrontation, and that both sides chose appeasement. And it's a very thoughtful, very interesting piece that I would recommend to people, but it raises exactly this point of how do we respond to these kinds of threats? Does it make sense to take the kind of cheerleading for the further militarization, which I think was a dangerous part of what we saw in President Biden's State of the Union the other night? This was not a cheerleading simply for the heroic people of Ukraine, but it was for continuing and expanding the war in Ukraine, which I think was quite problematic. There was nothing about diplomacy as an option there. On the question of the energy question, this is exactly a crucial one. And here again, I have a recommended article. I've been reading a lot these last couple of days. Naomi Klein has a very good piece on this question. Exactly. And it was, I forget where it was published, in The Intercept, I think, just in the last day or so. I think that we need to be fighting really hard for the very consistent intersection of our anti-war and peace movements with the climate justice movements, because the interests of both are so connected and so necessary. But in both cases, it will be easier to go back into a silo and draw an analysis based on that than it will be to have a collaboration, which is what we desperately need. So that working together of the peace movement and the climate justice movement is going to be crucial in this period to make sure that we don't allow responses from officials to say that, well, we're facing the possibility that the price of energy is going up, the price of gasoline is going up, the price of oil is going up. So the solution is to release, in this case, 30 million gallons, which is a pittance anyway, from the US reserve. And, oh, by the way, we'll allow a lot more fracking. That will be the answer. So we're going to have our hands full to fight back against those tendencies. The work of organizations like the Wellstone Club remains so critical, partly because education right now is so urgent. And it's hard, it's complicated, because from my vantage point, at least, the real focus immediately now needs to be on ending this war, that we need diplomacy, we need a ceasefire. And I think it's really hard for those of us in the US who have cut our political teeth appropriately on challenging all of the US wars, because there have been so many of them and they're all unjust and they needed to be challenged. And yet, at times we have to put aside our critique of that history and focus on the now, that this is a war being waged by Russia. We need to figure out how we can help move towards a diplomatic solution to this war, to end it, to get to a ceasefire, and at the same time, keep open the educational needs for all the people we work with around what's required in a moment like this, what's required to learn about the history of the US and NATO and all of the horrific history behind all that, and keep the focus on the now. Those are not easy things to balance, but I think that's the challenge that lies in front of us, the education and the activism and the mobilization in Congress, towards the White House, in our communities, the kinds of city council resolutions and state assembly resolutions, all of that. This is all crucial, because what we're looking at is transforming the public understanding of this, not as a moment for cheerleading a great and just war, but as standing in solidarity with the people that are being occupied and killed and helping them to get to the end of this war faster than ever. Thank you.
On behalf of the Wellstone Democratic Renewal Club, I want to say thank you so much to us for sharing your very informed opinions with us.